Get her out. The manager's voice cut through the bridal salon like a blade. Sharp. Final. Unforgiving. Sarah's hand was still extended toward the dress when the words hit her. Still reaching for the delicate French lace that had caught the afternoon light streaming through the window. Still mesmerized by the intricate beadwork that seemed to tell a story of love and dreams and forever promises. Her fingertips had barely grazed the fabric, barely felt the silk that cost more than she made in 6 months. But it was enough. The other seamstresses stopped working, needles frozen mid-stitch, conversations dying in their throats. Everyone in the boutique turned to stare at the girl who'd just committed the unforgivable sin. Touching merchandise without permission, handling a wedding dress without gloves, breaking the sacred rule that separated staff from dreams. Sarah's face burned with embarrassment as she pulled her hand back, her calloused fingers suddenly feeling rough and unworthy. Her simple work clothes suddenly feeling shabby in a room full of silk and satin and stories that cost thousands of dollars. But what the manager didn't know, what the other employees couldn't see, was that Sarah's touch wasn't careless or disrespectful. It was the touch of someone who understood fabric in ways that couldn't be taught. Someone who could feel the difference between machine stitching and hand embroidery. Someone whose fingers could read the story of every thread, every bead, every delicate pearl sewn with patience and precision. And what none of them could have imagined was that tomorrow the groom would walk through those same doors and ask one simple question that would change everything. The wedding dress hanging on display wasn't just merchandise. It was a masterpiece. $12,000 of French silk and Belgian lace, hand-beaded with Swarovski crystals, designed by someone whose name was whispered in fashion circles like a prayer. The kind of dress that transformed ordinary women into princesses. The kind of dress that made promises about happily ever after. The kind of dress that girls dreamed about from the time they were old enough to understand that someday they might be brides. And tomorrow when the groom saw it, he would know instantly that something magical had happened to it overnight. Welcome to Heroes Unheard. Before we continue with this incredible story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and your support means everything to us. Bella's Bridal Boutique occupied the corner of 5th Avenue like a temple to matrimonial dreams. 3 floors of wedding dresses, bridesmaid gowns, and accessories that promised to make every woman's special day perfect. The kind of place where appointments were booked months in advance. Where consultations came with champagne and tissues. Where mothers cried and daughters glowed and credit cards were maxed out for the sake of one perfect day. It was exclusive. It was expensive. It was everything Sarah Martinez had never been able to afford. Sarah had been working in the alterations department for 8 months. Hired not because of her resume, which was sparse, or her experience, which was limited, but because of her hands. Hands that could take in a waist without leaving marks. Hands that could shorten a hem so perfectly that it looked like the dress had been made that way. Hands that understood fabric and thread and the delicate architecture of dreams made real. She worked in the basement mostly, away from the customers, away from the consultations, away from the world of women who could spend more on a dress than Sarah made in a year. The other seamstresses liked her. Maria, who'd been there for 15 years, taught her techniques that weren't in any textbook. Rosa, who specialized in beadwork, showed her how to repair crystal damage without leaving traces. Even Helen, the head seamstress, who rarely praised anyone, had nodded approvingly at Sarah's French seams. But Sarah was still new, still learning, still trying to prove that she belonged in a place where perfection wasn't optional, it was required. The dress had arrived that morning, shipped from Paris in a climate-controlled container, unpacked by white-gloved hands, steamed with distilled water, hung on a custom form designed specifically for its proportions. It was the centerpiece of the boutique's spring collection, the dress that would be featured in magazines, the dress that would bring in customers from across the country, the dress that represented everything the boutique stood for: excellence, exclusivity, dreams that money could buy. Sarah first saw it when she came upstairs to deliver a finished alteration. The dress was positioned near the window where natural light would show off its details, where potential brides would see it first thing when they walked in, where it would catch the eye and capture the imagination and convince someone that $12,000 was a reasonable price for 8 hours of perfection. She stopped walking when she saw it, stopped breathing when she realized what she was looking at. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Every bead placed with intention. Every piece of lace cut and positioned to create patterns that seemed to flow like water. The bodice was structured with internal boning that would support without binding. The skirt was designed to move like liquid silk. The train was long enough to create drama, but not so long as to be impractical. It was everything a wedding dress should be. Everything Sarah had dreamed about since she was a little girl playing dress-up in her grandmother's closet. But it was more than that. It was familiar. The beadwork pattern looked like something she'd seen before. Something she'd sketched in margins during boring meetings. Something she'd dreamed about creating someday when she had the skills and the resources and the courage to believe her ideas were worth something. The dress looked like it had been pulled from her imagination and made real by someone with the talent and tools she'd never had access to. That's when she moved closer. That's when she forgot where she was and who she was and what the rules were. That's when she reached out like someone touching a miracle. Her fingers barely made contact, barely felt the silk before reality crashed back. Before the manager's voice cut through her reverie like scissors through thread. Mrs. Patterson had been managing Bella's bridal for 12 years. She'd built her reputation on maintaining standards, on ensuring that every dress, every consultation, every moment in her boutique met the expectations of women who demanded perfection. She'd seen girls like Sarah before. Girls from backgrounds where $12,000 dresses were fantasy, not possibility. Girls who looked at merchandise with longing instead of entitlement. Girls who didn't understand that some things were meant to be admired from a distance. Get her out. The words came automatically. Policy was policy. Staff didn't touch merchandise without permission. Staff didn't handle dresses without gloves. Staff didn't blur the lines between worker and customer, between dream and reality, between what was theirs and what belonged to someone else. Sarah was young. Sarah would learn. Sarah would find another job where her mistake wouldn't cost thousands of dollars if something went wrong. The other customers in the boutique watched the drama unfold with the uncomfortable fascination of people witnessing someone else's humiliation. A bride trying on veils stopped to stare. A mother and daughter selecting bridesmaid dresses whispered to each other. The consultant helping a nervous groom choose cufflinks shook her head in disapproval. Sarah had violated the sacred space. Sarah had forgotten her place. Sarah deserved whatever happened next. Sarah didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't try to defend what she'd done. She just gathered her things from the basement workroom, said goodbye to Maria and Rosa and Helen, who looked at her with sympathy mixed with relief that they hadn't been the ones caught reaching for something beyond their station. She walked out of Bella's bridal knowing she'd never be back, knowing she'd lost more than a job, knowing she'd lost her chance to be close to the kind of beauty she'd only ever dreamed about creating. But that night something extraordinary happened to the dress. Something that couldn't be explained by science or logic or the laws of fashion retail. Something that would only become apparent when the right person looked at it with the right eyes at the right moment. The dress began to glow. Not literally, not visibly, but with something deeper. Something that transformed mere fabric into something approaching magic. The next morning brought Michael Harrison to Bella's bridal. Not because he wanted to be there. Not because he enjoyed shopping for wedding accessories, but because his fiancée Amanda had insisted he approve the final details for their wedding. The flowers, the music, the dress. Everything had to be perfect for Amanda. Everything had to match her vision of what their special day should look like. And Michael loved Amanda enough to pretend that centerpieces and color schemes mattered to him as much as they mattered to her. Michael was successful, partner in a law firm, trust fund that had grown into serious money. The kind of man who could afford $12,000 dresses without checking his bank balance. The kind of man who understood that love sometimes meant paying for things that seemed ridiculously expensive but made the woman you loved ridiculously happy. He'd been patient through months of planning. Patient through tastings and fittings and consultations. Patient through decisions that seemed to require committees and second opinions and third opinions. But Michael was also something else. Something that Amanda didn't fully understand. Something that his law partners didn't see. Something that his trust fund couldn't buy. Michael was intuitive. Michael could sense things that other people missed. Michael could walk into a room and know immediately if something was wrong or right or different or special. And the moment he walked into Bella's bridal that morning, he knew something had changed. The dress was still hanging in the same place, still positioned to catch the light, still surrounded by the same accessories and complementary pieces. But something was different. Something was alive about it. Something was calling to him in a way that made him stop walking and stare and forget why he'd come there in the first place. The dress looked like it had been touched by someone who understood it, someone who appreciated it, someone who had seen its potential and awakened it. Mrs. Patterson approached him with the deference reserved for customers who could afford anything in the boutique. "Mr. Harrison, how wonderful to see you. Amanda said you might stop by to see the final arrangements. Everything is ready for next week's fitting. The dress has been pressed and steamed. The accessories have been selected. The alterations have been marked. Everything is perfect." But Michael wasn't listening to her words. He was staring at the dress, moving closer to it, seeing details that hadn't been visible before, patterns in the beadwork that seemed to tell stories, stitching that looked like poetry written in thread, a quality of light and shadow that made the fabric seem alive. He'd seen the dress before. Amanda had shown him photos. But this was different. This was extraordinary. Who touched this? The question came out before he could stop it, before he could think about why he was asking, or what answer he expected, or why it mattered. But somehow he knew that someone had touched the dress. Someone had connected with it. Someone had seen what he was seeing, and understood what he was understanding, and recognized what he was recognizing. Mrs. Patterson looked confused, nervous, like someone who'd been caught in a lie she hadn't meant to tell. "No one touched it, Mr. Harrison. The dress has been handled only by our professional staff. Only with gloves. Only according to proper procedures. No customer has tried it on. No unauthorized personnel have had access. The dress is exactly as it was when it arrived from Paris." But Michael knew better. Michael could see the truth in the way light caught the beadwork, in the way the silk hung on the form, in the way the entire dress seemed to radiate something that hadn't been there before. Someone had touched this dress. Someone had connected with it. Someone had understood it in a way that had changed it fundamentally. "I want to know who touched it." Michael's voice was quiet but firm. The voice of someone who was used to getting answers. Someone who didn't ask questions unless he needed to know. Someone who had learned to trust his instincts even when they didn't make logical sense. "This dress has been touched by someone who understood it. I want to know who." Mrs. Patterson looked around the boutique like she was hoping for rescue. Other staff members had gathered to watch the conversation. Customers had stopped their own shopping to listen. The atmosphere had shifted from routine retail to something more intense. Something that felt like an investigation. Something that felt like truth was about to surface. "Well," Mrs. Patterson began slowly. "There was an incident yesterday. A staff member in alterations. She touched the dress inappropriately. Without permission. Without gloves. She was terminated immediately, of course. Company policy is very clear about handling merchandise. There was no damage done. No reason for concern. The matter was handled professionally." But Michael wasn't satisfied. Wasn't ready to let the story end there. Wasn't willing to accept that someone had been punished for connecting with something beautiful. He looked at the dress again. Looked at the way it seemed to glow. Looked at the details that seemed more visible, more beautiful, more alive than they'd been before. "I want to see her," Michael said. The words surprised everyone, including himself. But once he'd said them, he knew they were right. Knew they were necessary. Knew they were part of something larger than a wedding dress or a boutique or a conversation about policy. "I want to meet the person who touched this dress." Mrs. Patterson's face went white. "Mr. Harrison, I don't think that's appropriate. The employee was terminated. The matter is closed. There's really no need to involve yourself in personnel issues. The dress is perfect. Your wedding will be perfect. There's no reason to complicate things." But Michael was already walking toward the register, already pulling out his checkbook, already making a decision that would change everything for everyone. "I'm buying this dress. Right now. Today. But I'm not taking it until I meet the person who touched it. The person who understood it. The person who made it come alive." The silence in the boutique was complete. Customers stared. Staff members whispered. Mrs. Patterson looked like she was having a heart attack. Michael had just offered to buy a $12,000 wedding dress with conditions that made no business sense, with demands that violated every protocol, with requirements that challenged everything the boutique stood for. "Her name is Sarah Martinez." The voice came from the back of the group. Maria, the seamstress who'd worked there for 15 years, who'd taught Sarah techniques that weren't in textbooks, who'd watched her touch that dress with reverence and understanding and love. "She lives on Cedar Street. Apartment 3B. She's probably looking for work today since you fired her for caring too much about something beautiful." Mrs. Patterson looked at Maria like she'd just committed treason. Maria looked back without flinching, like someone who'd finally found the courage to tell truth to power, like someone who'd watched injustice happen and decided not to be silent anymore, like someone who recognized that some moments are too important for cowardice. Michael wrote the check, handed it to Mrs. Patterson, and walked out of Bella's bridal with a purpose that surprised him. He was going to find Sarah Martinez. He was going to understand why her touch had transformed a dress. He was going to discover what connection she'd made that had awakened something magical. And he was going to find out why meeting her felt more important than any wedding planning he'd ever done. Sarah was sitting in her small apartment staring at classified ads when the knock came. She'd been fired from 3 jobs in 2 years. Not because she wasn't skilled, not because she wasn't dedicated, but because she was different. Because she saw beauty where others saw merchandise. Because she connected with things in ways that made supervisors nervous. Because she touched the world like someone who understood its secrets. She opened the door expecting to see her landlord asking about rent. Instead, she saw a man in an expensive suit holding a bouquet of flowers and wearing an expression that looked like wonder mixed with determination, mixed with something that might have been recognition. "Are you Sarah Martinez?" he asked. "The seamstress who worked at Bella's bridal. The person who touched the wedding dress yesterday." Sarah nodded slowly, confused but not afraid. There was something about this stranger that felt safe. Something that felt right. Something that felt like the beginning of a story she'd been waiting her whole life to hear. "My name is Michael Harrison," he said. "I'm supposed to get married next week. To someone else. In that dress you touched. But when I saw what your touch did to it, when I saw how it came alive under your hands, when I felt what you understood about it, I realized something that's going to change everything." He paused, looked at her with eyes that seemed to see more than her appearance, more than her circumstances, more than the gap between his world and hers. "I realized that the person who should be wearing that dress, the person who understands what it means, the person who can make it come alive, the person I should be spending my life with, is you." The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours. Michael learned about Sarah's childhood, about a grandmother who'd taught her to sew, about dreams of designing dresses that would make women feel beautiful, about a scholarship to fashion school that she'd had to turn down because her family needed her income, about years of working in factories and alterations shops, about touching fabric like other people touched music. Sarah learned about Michael's engagement, about a relationship built on compatibility rather than connection, about a wedding planned more for show than for love, about a trust fund that had never bought him happiness, about a career that paid well but fed nothing in his soul, about walking into that boutique and seeing a dress that had been transformed by someone who understood beauty in ways he'd never encountered. By evening, they both knew that something unprecedented was happening, something that challenged every assumption about love and fate and finding the right person at the wrong time. Michael called Amanda, had the hardest conversation of his life, ended an engagement that had been based on logic rather than magic, canceled a wedding that would have been perfect in every way except the most important one. Sarah called her grandmother, the woman who'd taught her that fabric had feelings, that thread had stories, that the right hands could make ordinary materials extraordinary. Her grandmother listened to the story, listened to the confusion and wonder and fear in Sarah's voice. And then she said something that made everything clear. "Mija, sometimes the universe sends us exactly what we need in ways we never expect. Sometimes love comes disguised as scandal. Sometimes the right person appears at the moment when choosing them seems impossible. But when magic happens, when real magic happens, you don't question it. You don't analyze it. You don't let other people tell you it's wrong. You say yes." The wedding took place 6 months later. Not in a cathedral with 500 guests. Not with a 12-piece orchestra and imported flowers and photographers who cost more than most people's cars. But in a small church with family and friends who understood that they were witnessing something rare. Something real. Something that proved love doesn't follow schedules or logic or other people's expectations. Sarah wore the dress. The same dress she'd touched with reverent fingers. The same dress that had called to her across the barriers of class and circumstance and possibility. The same dress that had somehow known she was its destined wearer long before anyone else figured it out. And when she walked down the aisle, everyone in the church could see what Michael had seen. The dress didn't just fit her body. It fit her soul. Mrs. Patterson was not invited to the wedding. But Maria was. Rosa was. Helen was. The seamstresses who'd recognized Sarah's talent, who'd watched her transform ordinary alterations into works of art, who'd known that someone with her gift wouldn't stay hidden forever. They sat in the front row wiping tears and smiling at justice that looked like poetry. Michael's law partners were confused. His family was concerned. His friends thought he'd lost his mind. But his grandmother, the one person whose opinion mattered, understood immediately. She took one look at Sarah in that dress. One look at the way Michael watched Sarah. One look at the light that seemed to surround them both. And she knew her grandson had found something that money couldn't buy, and logic couldn't explain, and society couldn't improve upon. The reception was small but perfect. Sarah's family brought homemade food. Michael's family brought expensive wine. The combination created something better than either could have achieved alone. The photographer was a friend who worked for hugs instead of fees. The band was a local group that played music for dancing instead of show. The cake was made by Sarah's aunt, who decorated it with sugar flowers that looked like the beadwork on the dress. But the moment everyone remembered happened during the first dance. Michael and Sarah moved together like they'd been dancing their whole lives. Like they'd been waiting for each other across years and circumstances and coincidences that had finally aligned. The dress flowed around Sarah like liquid light. Michael held her like she was made of dreams. And everyone watching understood that they were witnessing something that proved fairy tales could happen to real people in real time. After the wedding, Sarah opened her own shop. Not a bridal boutique like Bella's, but a studio where she designed dresses for women who understood that beauty wasn't about price tags. Where she created gowns that transformed ordinary moments into extraordinary memories. Where brides came not because they could afford $12,000, but because they wanted to work with someone who understood that the right dress could change everything. Michael left his law firm, used his trust fund to invest in small businesses, spent his time helping people turn dreams into reality, discovered that money was more satisfying when it created opportunities instead of just accumulating interest. Found purpose in work that mattered instead of work that paid well. Together they created a life that looked nothing like what either had planned, but everything like what both had always wanted. A life built on recognizing magic when it appeared, on trusting instincts that defied logic, on understanding that the best love stories begin with someone brave enough to reach out and touch something beautiful even when they're not supposed to. 5 years later, Sarah still kept a photo on her workroom wall. A picture from that day at Bella's bridal. The moment her fingers touched the dress. The moment that changed everything. The moment that proved sometimes the most important rules are the ones that need to be broken. Sometimes the biggest mistakes are actually the smallest miracles. Sometimes getting fired is the first step toward finding exactly where you belong. And sometimes a wedding dress knows who it's meant for long before anyone else figures it out. Sometimes fabric has wisdom that transcends policy. Sometimes beauty calls to the people who understand it, even when understanding it costs them everything they thought they wanted. Sometimes touching something sacred is worth losing everything safe. The dress still hangs in Sarah's closet, preserved and protected, but not hidden. Sometimes she takes it out and shows it to young seamstresses who work in her studio. Women who dream of creating beauty, but worry they don't have the right credentials or connections or courage. She tells them about the day she touched something she wasn't supposed to touch, about the moment that changed her life, about the magic that happens when you stop being afraid of your own instincts. And she always ends the story the same way, with advice that sounds simple but requires courage to follow. Sometimes the most beautiful things in life are waiting for someone brave enough to reach out and touch them. Sometimes the person you're meant to be is hiding behind the person you think you're supposed to be. Sometimes love disguises itself as disaster until you're brave enough to look closer. Touch the beautiful things. Trust your hands. Trust your heart. Trust that some rules exist to be broken by people who understand why they matter. And remember that fairy tales don't happen to perfect people in perfect circumstances. They happen to real people who choose magic over safety, who choose truth over convenience, who choose love over logic. This story was brought to you by Heroes Unheard. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition, but deserved more than anyone else? Someone who saw beauty where others saw rules. Someone who touched the world with hands that understood more than their circumstances suggested. Someone who taught you that magic exists for people brave enough to reach for it. Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how their courage inspired your own. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.